I'm Guildmaster Dan, and welcome to the Fourth Wall. You know, sometimes as a game master, you just want to run something obscure, maybe even esoteric. Maybe there's a video game or a board game that you like the setting of, or maybe you were inspired to a setting by a story you read, or something that you read online. Well, the game masters will still run those games. But what they'll typically do is they'll either find a universal system like GURPS or Savage Worlds and apply those to the setting, or, a lot of game masters will just take their favorite system and rework it to apply to the new setting, like maybe Dungeons and Dragons or Call of Cthulhu. But for those game masters out there who really like modding current systems and maybe like creating their own things, there's always creating house systems, which is what we're going to be talking about today, how to make your house system. Now, something to keep in mind when you're going into creating your house system is that house games tend to not run as long as normal campaigns. That is to say, typically when you create a house system, you're creating it either for a specific setting so that you can play out, a short period of time, maybe at a con, or, maybe with your group just for a little bit so you guys can run around in that setting. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean house games can't run for a very long time. For example, I just recently ended my SCP game that I've mentioned a couple times before, and that ran for over a year. Well, the reason why I bring this up is, what I would recommend when you're going into creating your house system is to aim for a more universal rule set, something more like GURPS or Savage Worlds, something where you'll be able to take these rules and apply them to multiple settings. Maybe you'll need to tweak them along the way as appropriate to that setting, but aim for something either rules light or something at least flexible that you can apply it to different settings, just because you'll be able to reuse this for when you get an itch to run something else. Maybe you start out running it or using your house system to run Mass Effect, and, another time you retweak it so that you can run that same system at a con to run a Jurassic Park game. Make it flexible so that you can get the most out of all the work that you're about to put into it. That being said, I would probably recommend stay away from making it a crunchier system, if you will, something fully realized that you would sell, just because, if this is really just going to stay as an in-house system, you want to keep that flexibility in mind. If you put in all of that extra work, that's great, but it's going to make it harder to adjust it to other things later. Further, if it is going to be just a short-term play period, maybe you're just going to run for a single adventure over a few sessions, all that extra work done to make it crunchy will have been, maybe wasted. But, if you do end up making it crunchier, you could always develop it and, put it up on RPG Now, so, to each his own. But I recommend going for flexible and lighter. Now, when you're actually going into making your rules, there are two things that you absolutely need to do first. Two rule sets, two systems that you need to come up with first that the rest of the house system is going to be based around. The first is pretty straightforward, your core mechanic. This is the, what everybody's used to, how you resolve chance in your game. The D20, it's you roll a D20. In Call of Cthulhu and other percentile systems, you roll 2D10 based against your stat. You want to come up with what you're going to base your entire game around. What's your core mechanic? Do you roll 2D10 against a percentage in order to determine whether the character succeeds or fails? Do you roll a D20 against a set difficulty to determine? Do you roll a bunch of D6s do you roll a bunch of D6s or a bunch of D10s? Maybe even a bunch of D20s or D30s. What are you going to base your system around? Decide on your core mechanic. There are lots of different ways to do it. If you're not familiar with a bunch of games, check out your local gaming shop or maybe even just a Barnes and Noble. Look read the intro chapter of those, because they'll typically describe their core mechanic in them and look at different ways you can do it. Next is your character composition. This being when your players sit down and make their character, what will comprise that character? What statistics, what skills, what subsystems will comprise their character mechanically? Now, naturally, in a role-playing game, the character's personality and their history, that's going to be what really makes the character. But when you're designing a system, you are looking at the mechanics. So you need to actually figure out what mechanically will describe that character. You know, will that character be described by stats? How many? Are those stats going to be more broad, or are they going to be very specific? Are you going to have like 12 different stats? Typically, in my house system and in a lot that I've run in, 3 base stats tend to work out very well, because you can break it up into very simple concepts such as mind, body, spirit. But you can work it into other things. I mean, if you look at Numenera, which I talked about recently, you know, that's pretty much a 3-stat system, and that's strength, speed, and will. But yeah, 3 tends to work out well, but if you decide you want to go closer to Dungeons & Dragons or other systems that have it more specific, you can do that. Again, to each their own. But the important thing is you need to figure out each subsystem that is going to make up your character, because that and the core mechanic are going to determine what every other system in the game does. Every other system that you add to the game is going to draw back to those 2 things. And really, you want to do your core mechanic first, because probably, most likely, unless you come up with something really innovative or interesting, your character composition is probably going to rely upon that mechanic. So do your core mechanic first, then work on your character composition, and then work on all the other systems that go into it. Now, granted, you can run a game with just those 2 mechanics right there, but there's still some room to leave it flexible and still add actual systems. Now, you can have your system be where you run it very rules light with, say, for example, gear and money and, you know, combat. You can run it really light where, you know, all of those things are really just story details, and, you know, it really comes down to you as a game master agreeing with the player what they actually carry and what they can carry, and how much money they have, and just kind of a general agreement, and base like, say, combat damage or, you know, your rolls just off those basic stats. That's fine. You know, that works for a lot of online games too, like message board based games. You know, for a lot of those are diceless systems, but they still have stats. And everything's based off those stats. There's no, like, subsystems or any, there's no, like, there's no systems for money or equipment or anything like that. It's just the stats. And it works out just fine there, and it can work out just fine here as well. A lot of rules-like games will do that. But that being said, there are lots of other systems you can put in there. For example, I mentioned a few of them. You know, your combat systems, meaning how your combat will actually work. That's actually, depending upon your setting, something that you'll probably want to move to next, just because there's different ways to run it. Say how you run your initiative, how turn order works, how everything in a turn will work, rather than the order of turns, because that would be initiative, which I just described. But the point being, you'll probably want to move to combat next, depending upon your setting. Now, if you're running, say, something very intellectually based or investigation based, say, like Myst, or even just something based in, you know, being a detective in New York, something simple like that. You might not always see combat, so it might be less important. Heck, if you're running a Myst game, I doubt you'll have any combat. Or if you do, it'll be designed to be, like, done. Keep your setting in mind when you're adding on these systems and designing them. What can make it a lot easier for you, though, when you come to add your combat, your encumbrance systems, your currency systems, or your Benny systems. For those of you unfamiliar, I'm using the term Benny from Savage Worlds, meaning those little points that you get that, you know, let players, you know, turn them in order to, like, get a clue or to re-roll a die. You know, Benny points, luck points, will points, whatever you want to. Something that can help you when you get to this portion of making your house system is look at all the systems that you like. I mean, all of your favorite RPGs. Look at how that they did these things, and this is your chance to recognize that in those games, all of the systems that make up the RPG, all of the mechanics are modular. You can actually separate, you can completely, very easily separate the encumbrance system from Dungeons and Dragons because you like it. You can grab that, pull it off the shelf, set it down in your box, and then turn to, let's say Rogue Trader that does a completely different currency system from Dungeons and Dragons. But let's say you like the profit factor system where you're rolling for, whether you can buy things. Well, you can pull that right out because there's nothing. That works just fine here. It might need a little tweak depending upon your core mechanic, but they work just fine by themselves. They're modular, and you can very easily slip them into your system. It's a great way to fill out those extra systems without having to put in a lot of work, especially if you want to go for a crunchier house system. You know, recognizing that your favorite systems, or even just ones that you just liked a specific thing from, those specific mechanics, those systems are modular and very easily pulled out and slipped into your game. You might need a little bit of tweaking or a little modding, but hey, that's fine because we're making our own system here. Heck, I may even go so far to say that a house system might be a good way to see what your game master's favorite games are, just based upon the systems that they slip in there from their favorite one, using their favorite mechanics. Now, granted, there is a lot of things that go into making a house system, and I just brought you some simple tips to help guide your way. But maybe there was something that I said that you disagreed with, or something that I didn't bring up. By all means, feel free to leave a comment below. Please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep the conversation going. And as always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. I like how they switch straws. Anyway.